Hello everybody, this is the lecture for competition and cooperation. We're basically going to go over just some basic concepts, and we're going to talk about various social dilemmas based on ideas of competition, and we'll look at some simple strategies to increase cooperation. So let's just start with some terms. So cooperation, you probably already know what this is. Basically, cooperation is people working together, and typically when we talk about cooperation, it's to work together to meet some sort of goal, and the individuals are basically seen as profiting or benefiting from that cooperative behavior. Obviously, cooperation would happen most if we trust the people we are interacting with, and cooperation would be best or optimal if we are willing to share and communicate. Obviously, you need to coordinate things and communicate to cooperate. And then competition. Sorry about that. Competition. So we try to look out for ourselves. Dog eat dog world. Typically there's a perception of limited rewards, and so you look out for yourself and you try to grab as much for yourself, knowing that or believing that there's a limited amount of rewards out there. And then obviously, whether it's true or not, I think this is the thing. I want to talk more about the perception, but I guess there is a limited amount of stuff, I guess, if you want to get nitpicky about it. And so there's a limited amount of stuff there, and if you take more, other people will get less. And obviously conflict is aggressive behavior, hostility, violence as a result of perceived unfairness. So competitive situations tend to breed unfair feelings in people, and that could lead to aggression. So social psychology, thinking about situational factors of things, so situational factors of competition. So source of conflict, so it's a little bit vague here, but it could be various sources. It could be perceptions of limited reward, it could be perceptions of another group being different than you, various sources of conflict. And of course, once there's these sources or perceived sources of conflict, then you start having perceptions about the other people, the other groups that you're competing with. And that, of course, arouses all sorts of negative emotions. Probably a host of positive and negative emotions. Typically, under competitive circumstances, you tend to start feeling better about people in your group. So if it's a group-to-group competition, so in your group, whether that group is a small group of 3 people, or it could be larger, it could be thousands of people. It could even be like one part of the state versus another part of the state, or it could be state versus state, or it could be country versus country. There's basically unlimited amount of possibilities in terms of how you perceive the group that you're in and the group that you're not part of. And so there's my point here is that there could be positive emotions about your group. So in competitive situations, typically you start having more positive feelings about your group and less positive feelings or emotions about the other group. So it's a bit of a mix, but I think we have a lot of data out there. If you are only feeling positive about your group by pushing down or having to compete with another group, you're probably going down a wrong path. Less sports. Sports are a different thing. Obviously sports are a competitive thing. Only one team can win unless it's hockey or soccer or something like that. But basketball, baseball, football. Football has ties once in a while too. At least in the playoffs for footballs, you can't have two teams tying. There's a winner or a loser. And so in sports, it's actually no problem. And typically the athletes themselves, except under certain extreme circumstances, typically they'll bash each other as hard as they can during the game, but after the game they'll shake hands and they're friends. So that's not really causing the positive and negative feelings. But we know that fans are actually worse. Fans are actually pretty horrible in my opinion. They can be good in some cases, but you've heard of things like people stabbing fans of another team because they got into some sort of shouting match after the game, or beating them up, or beating people and putting them in hospitals, or things that are pretty nasty but not as severe. Like I had a student who was from Chicago and I believe was a White Sox fan because their mother was, and they were at a game with the Cubs, and it was at Wrigley Field, and the student of mine was just simply wearing a White Sox, and she was young, so she was under 18, so she was not an adult either. She was wearing a White Sox jersey and hat, I believe. That was her crime, and some Cub fan, decided to take this under 18, so a child, probably around 14, 15, and dump two glasses of beer on top of her head from above. That's, to me, that's pretty disgusting. I mean, it's just, there's two different teams. I mean, the teams don't do this to each other. Why would fans do this? So some fans get out of hand and take it too far. Obviously there are fans who are more kind to each other, but I'm always remarked by the aggression of fans when actually they don't have much of a stake in it, except for, I guess that's probably it, probably their identity. Somehow they got their identity tied into this thing, and then all of a sudden it's good and bad. No, it's just another team that you're playing. And I've been at games where I haven't said anything because I didn't want to get to fights with people, but I've seen people just say the worst things to players on the other team, and I'm like, this is just a guy trying to make a living, and he's playing a sport. It's set up this way, and then you're saying all these like horrible things about him just because he's on the other team. It's just, to me, it's kind of disgusting. But we can see that this is just rises from all this perception of competition, and some people just can't put it in its place. And then we have then there's what's called manifest conflicts. That's the behaviors. So I guess in the thing I was just talking about right now, there's a perception that the White Sox are a horrible team, evil people by the Cubs fans, at least some of them, I guess, and arouses negative emotions if they see the jersey. And so the manifest conflict would be pouring a beer over a child's head or a teenager's head. So manifest is actual behavior, things you actually see. And just another example, maybe why you shouldn't do this type of stuff. So I had a professor who was a University of Washington graduate and fan, and she took her family, including two young kids, to a UCLA game because she actually lived in Southern California, and apparently there was the Rose Bowl, which is where they play, UCLA. They try to separate out the fans. They try to make sure that the Washington fans are separate from the UCLA fans just to avoid this type of situation. And apparently there was two UCLA fans. You can probably guess the general type of 20, 30, 40-year-old males. Sorry, I'm in that group roughly, so I'm putting myself down too. Who are UCLA fans, bought tickets in the Washington seats just to, for one, they were drunk as heck from what she was telling me, and then two, their main point was to try to get under the skin of the visiting team. And apparently it was such a horrible situation that they were really horrible in what they were saying, including their language. And apparently the this professor I had, her husband basically asked the guys to kind of calm it down because they had young kids, and basically those guys said bad words back to them, and their kids started crying. And they actually eventually left because the kids were crying. They just said they can't put up with this. And I guess as they were leaving, some of the Washington fans had enough of it, and apparently a big brawl. I don't know if I'm calling it brawl because it was probably 2 against 20 or something like that at that point, broke out. And so, you can see this escalation here. So there's manifest behavior. Manifest means you can see it. And so there's manifest conflict. So people are yelling back and forth. And it tends to escalate. So just like that little situation, these 2 jerks who I guess want to just try to be jerks to other people. And then somebody says, calm down. And they say, no, you go, blank, blank. And then some people can leave, but then there's people who are still around wanting to watch the game, and it ends up escalating into a big fight. So these things can start small, and then it can tend to escalate over like stupid, silly stuff. And then the conflict outcome. So it can be good and bad. So from my illustration, obviously it was bad. It was probably some arrest. Probably those jerks. I'm guessing they probably got a little bit of what they kind of deserved. I'm not justifying physical use of force against people, but these guys were not innocent people either. So they actually escalated a situation that came back on them. And of course, then people who got involved in that on both sides were arrested. So it's not a really good outcome. But of course, you could have a positive outcome, I guess. If you have tensions and if you maybe can talk to the person and say, listen, aren't you being kind of extreme? Don't you think that this is a little bit overboard for the situation? Why can't we just root for our teams? There's nothing wrong with these 2 colleges. They're basically the same type of people at both. It's not like one's good and bad. If you can turn the other people around, then would be a good outcome. It's just hard because people tend to escalate. So once you start becoming angry, it's really hard to de-escalate that stuff, especially when you feel the other side isn't reasonable and isn't listening. And so retaliation. So that's the other thing too, is conflicts can last a long time because of retaliation. Something happens, and then this group feels it has to retaliate, and then this group has to retaliate. You can see it in different things, and you might disagree with me, but conflicts like the IRA, Irish Republican Army, wanting independence from Britain, at least when they had the quote-unquote troubles, it would seem like, the IRA would blow up something, and hurt some people, and then the British government would arrest a number of IRA members, whether they were involved or not, and they throw them in jail, and then the IRA would retaliate, would blow up something else, and then the British government would do some other action, and then there'd be this endless retaliation. And we might also see it in the Middle East. So Hamas or the PLO, I think the PLO is kind of gone by the wayside, but in the past, the PLO or now Hamas might do something in Israel, and then the Israeli government will lob some missiles or other things into the territory of the Palestinians as retaliation, and then of course then the Hamas or the PLO in the past would feel like they have to retaliate, and it just seems like it's endless retaliation. And so that's the problem with competition, is could be endless in retaliation. Of course, the British government and the people in power, essentially, the British government and the Israeli government will probably argue British in the past, and the current Israeli government might argue that, well, this is just the way that we're going to deal with it. We're going to show them if they do something, we're going to punish them. But the problem is it could lead to this retaliatory cycle. So conflicts are very tricky to deal with. And of course, then if you try to negotiate with the other side, then some people might say you're rewarding the violence of the other side. So I'm not saying there's easy answers here. I'm just saying that there tends to be a cycle of retaliation, especially in cases where you're perceiving the other side as different than you, is evil, isn't morally just in what they're doing. These types of situations tend to live on and on over time. I'm just going to bring all of these out. So conflict, so obviously conflict has certain types of outcomes. So increased negative perception, so increased negative perceptions of the other side is what we're really talking about. So obviously increased negative perception of the other side is going to increase retaliation and increase conflict over time. Strengthens social identity, so I'm sort of saying that there was quote-unquote positive and negative emotions. So one of the things is that your identity in your group that is in conflict with another group will become stronger. But of course, the stronger you see your group as different and separate and morally better than the other group, is going to lead to more conflict and retaliation because you feel like you are justified. Hostile group norms, so obviously the group norms are we are good, they are evil, therefore we're justified in being mean to them, being angry to them, being hostile to them, being violent to them. Negative stereotypes of the outgroup, so your group is the in-group, the other group you're having conflict with is the outgroup. So typically under these competitive, conflictual, retaliatory situations, you start developing negative stereotypes of an outgroup. And so the outgroup is stupid, is immoral, is lazy, is going to ruin our country, these types of things. And I think the social media, especially with memes, are especially bad in terms of bad in the sense of the effects are bad. The effectiveness is high. So those memes are usually pretty effective to generate and reinforce negative stereotypes of an outgroup. But those memes are really bad because they're usually meant to be semi-humorous, and people tend not to challenge them. They tend to chuckle at them or something like that. But they definitely reinforce stereotypes of another group, and that's not a good thing. Outgroup homogeneity, which means that when you view people in the outgroup, the other group that you have in conflict with, you see them as all the same. Oh, they're all evil. They all are this. They all are this. They all are blank. Something pejorative. So they're all the same. Of course, that's not great because people differ. And probably there's different ideas that each group has that's probably worthwhile to explore. And so to sort of say that every idea is stupid, everybody in that group is evil, everybody in that group wants to ruin the country, etc., that's outgroup homogeneity. De-individuation, which means that when you're stereotyping these negative stereotypes, especially the outgroup, you start looking at them as all the same. Oh, I'm sorry, I just talked about that. The de-individuation means that this is basically saying the same thing. De-individuation just basically means you stop seeing those people as individuals and as some sort of evil group. So you see somebody with a certain shirt or a certain hat or a certain whatever, and you assume that they're bad because they're all like that. And this is one of the reasons why wars and countries have propaganda machines. And so part of what they want to do is they want to convince people that the people that you could be going to war with or you are at war with are not human. So dehumanization, they're not worth thinking about, they're not an individual person, they're not humans. And of course that's a dangerous step to take. Reduced interaction. So typically what you see is when there's this increase in conflict and competition, and there's this sort of retaliatory cycle, typically what happens is that the groups tend to stop talking to each other. And of course, if people stop talking to each other, it's very easy for them to de-individuate the other person, to dehumanize them, because now they're just a blur, a group on the other side. And you're obviously not able to find out about them personally. You're not able to make a personal connection with them. You're not able to see them as individuals. And of course, then you also don't share ideas. And so your ideas become then into silos that you don't share these ideas. And so maybe the other group has very similar ideas. It's just maybe there's some slight differences about what to do with them. But those discussions are not had. So this whole pot here of things is a very dangerous pot. And unfortunately, I think in our country, we're kind of at this point. Hopefully we can get pulled out of this soon, but I think we've seen all of these things in our country within the last 5 years or so. So some people argue that there's benefits of competition and conflict. I put a question mark there because I think we want to question these benefits. Here it says increased fitness, so it's kind of an evolutionary sort of argument, or maybe a social Darwinism type of argument, which is if there's limited resources and everybody's fighting over it, it's going to increase the fitness of the winners, essentially. So society is going to benefit, or humanity is going to benefit, because the most fit will be on top and will survive, and therefore those fit genes and things like that will be passed on. And even some models of economic development sort of emphasize this, that if a business makes more money, it therefore means it's better, and therefore we should allow any companies to make as much money because they're better. They increase the fitness of the economy because of that. It's sort of the model of some economic philosophers. I think that's probably not a good model, because it's getting more money doesn't necessarily mean that you are benefiting the country or benefiting people, or making better products. You could be making really crappy products at a very low cost at a high markup because somehow you've created a false demand or something like that. So this is one perspective, but obviously it's a perspective that I don't buy into. And with cooperation, you can also increase fitness too, if you think about evolutionary theory. But anyway, I'm trying to argue benefits of competition and conflict here based on some people's ideas. Social comparison information. So some people have argued that people become motivated when they compare themselves to other people, compare themselves in terms of their abilities and skills, things that they can do, and then of course their outcomes. And so they might argue that if you see that your neighbor has a bigger house than you and a fancier car, maybe that will motivate you to work harder. I think you can tell probably by the tone of my voice that I also don't really buy into this thing. It's probably more demotivating than motivating, but this is the argument of some people. And then increased social identity. We already talked about that, but that's a double-edged sword. So it might be great to be part of a group, but if being part of that group is at the expense of another group, that's probably not a really great thing that you have going on. So we're just going to look at some norms. So remember, social norms are typically implicit beliefs about members of a society, and society could be a small group, or it could be a large group. Like even we could say even like Western culture could be a society or social norm. So norms are beliefs shared by a group about how to act, and about the world, what the world is like. And I sort of say this because I think that broader definition of norms kind of fits what we're talking about here. So there's the social fairness norms. So social fairness norms would be that you should treat people fairly. So I don't know whether that, yeah, this is more for cooperation, sorry. Um, so distributive means that everybody should have a fair share of the reward. So if you're in a group and you cooperate, everybody should get the same share. Regardless of how much you've sort of contributed to it. You don't do that. You just say everybody gets this. And if you follow sports, another sports thing, so typically what happens is if a team goes to the playoffs, they typically get some sort of playoff share, which means the team as a whole gets some sort of amount of money based on if they go to the playoffs and how many games they win, if they win the championship, et cetera. They get a share, a playoff share. And from what I know with a lot of team sports, such as with a lot of team members, maybe in basketball it's a little bit easier because you have fewer team members. But in sports like baseball or football, where you have rosters of what would it be 22 to 50 or so for football. You have a lot of people there. You get the share. The team gets a share, and typically, what the team does, the team usually votes. And as far as I know, I've never ever heard of this person was our best player. They should get 5 times than everybody else or something like that. I've never heard that. I've always heard equal shares, and even somebody who might only play, let's say, 3 games in a season, if they're on the playoff roster, they get an equal share typically. So that's a distributed fairness norm that, even though you got one person who played almost every game and was the best player, maybe was the MVP of the league, they get the exact same playoff share as some buddy sitting there on the bench most of the time and maybe played for 3 minutes for the whole season. They get the same share. That's distributive. Procedural fairness. This is just basically talking about the procedures to make a decision about how to distribute the rewards, and that these procedures should be fair. So I wouldn't worry so much about these definitions, just kind of remember the basic principles. I think some of these definitions get kind of close to each other and maybe don't convey some of the deeper things. The procedural things, I think we kind of all understand that. If you're cooperating in a group, you need to communicate in a way that everybody feels like it's fair how you're dividing up the rewards. Social norms for cooperation still. So social fairness norms. So getting on that still. This is kind of the bad side of it. This stuff is kind of nice, and then here's the bad side of it. One of the bad sides of these norms is blaming the victim. So if you see somebody having negative outcomes, so not getting resources or maybe being punished, and what you do is you attribute, which means you say that person got nothing or got punished because of something wrong with the other person, and so they deserve it. So some of the blaming the victims that for sure we see in our society is that a lot of people blame poor people. They'll say things like, "Oh, those poor people who are on welfare, they're just lazy. They're just lazy and stupid." So it's blaming somebody who's very likely due to socioeconomic structures and economy and possible, prejudicial and discriminatory structures. Is that, that's why you're poor. It's because of discrimination and poverty, cycles of poverty, and that this country doesn't necessarily invest in poor people well. And so there's actually external factors for why a lot of people are poor. But blaming the victim perspective it says, oh, those poor people, because of something inside of them, they're lazy, they're stupid, that's why they're poor. That's blaming the victim. We also see this in in bad ways with like rape victims. So if you ever heard about rape victims, some people will say, well, they were actually making out with this guy before, so she shouldn't have did that because, she led him on. So it's blaming the victim. No, kissing somebody doesn't mean that you're consenting to other things. But if you hear that type of statements, and certainly you've probably heard those things, that's blaming the victim. Or something like, well, she was asking for it because she was dressed in a certain way. Women shouldn't dress provocatively because men can't control themselves, so it's her fault. I've heard this. I've heard this even recently. Maybe not in this country, but I've heard it in other countries. It's actually a defense to rape. And I think it was a successful defense to rape. So this type of belief system is blaming the victim. So that's kind of the bad side of social fairness, that if you end up on the wrong side of rewards and punishment, that people say you deserve it because of social fairness. So it's a fair world, it's a just world. So if you got this or that, you deserved it because it's a just world. So let's talk about some reactions to unfairness or perceptions of unfairness. So let's say that you live in a roughly cooperative society or group, but you end up on the short end of the stick and you end up there all the time. You might have certain reactions. One is false consciousness. So you actually might accept a low status, so not getting enough rewards, having a low status in the group, and seeing it as acceptable because you also believe that society is proper and normal and there's something wrong with you. And we actually see quite a bit of research on that. So like if you make kids kind of, and we'll probably watch this when we talk about prejudice, is the blue eye, brown eye study that was done in Kansas, and this is with all white people, and this is back in the 70s or something like that, or 60s, maybe in the late 60s. The teacher would say that the blue-eyed kids are the smart kids, and they're the good kids, and the brown-eyed kids are the stupid kids, and the evil kids, and the dumb kids. And when a teacher did that, those kids turned on each other pretty fast. And by the way, they would flip too. So if the next day the teacher said brown-eyed kids are smart and the blue eyes are stupid, those kids that were discriminated against and had a lot of prejudice against them one day were very fine the next day being on top and doing the same to the other group. So when you look at those things, you actually see that those kids feel bad about themselves. They sort of accept that low status, and actually stays with them too. So they interviewed these same people, 20, 30 years later, and they still feel that. They still feel that low status. You can actually see it. So we'll watch that video later. But basically, if people accept that low status and act depressed, basically what you do is you act depressed. You could act in ways that you're not very agenic, which means you don't try anymore. Why should you try? Because you're not getting anywhere anyway. So there's you kind of call it acceptance of that low status. You could try to leave the low status group and join the higher one. So one reaction to unfairness is to try to move up. Another sort of reaction to unfairness is social creativity. So if you're in a low status group in that society, you might think of ways to be very creative and sort of promote your identity and see it as a positive thing and not as a negative thing, because obviously society is telling you it's a negative thing, but then you're flipping it and saying, no, this is actually positive stuff. And then collective action, so change, so challenging the power structure. and it says one group, but it could be multiple people from multiple groups. So, but basically, it's collective means more than one person. So some sort of push for social change, and I think we're also in this type of a stage now. Let's see where it goes, but definitely there's been a lot of discussion of this issue recently. Let's look at social dilemmas. What are social dilemmas? Basically, I'm trying to boil this down a little bit because some of this language might be a little bit more complex. Basically, you have things that people might share. So if you're in a sort of semi-cooperative society, there might be some sort of what we call public goods, so things that are shared by the community. And essentially everybody has access to that. But we'll kind of deal with this a little bit. Actually, then the social dilemmas is really where there could be a creation of conflict. It says here use of public goods, but I think some of our examples are just more conflictual. But what the conflict tends to be is if you act together, you could both benefit. So it's kind of like a public good, if you will. But if you don't work together, there could be some negative outcomes for you. So some examples. So we're just going to talk about some examples. So part of social psychology is that there's these little terms that they like you to know. Harvesting dilemma. So basically, there's common goods. I'll make sure I'm using the term right. Public goods. So, but public goods, so common goods, and then a social dilemma is that people maybe see it as it's theirs for grabbing, and then everybody starts grabbing, and then it's overused. So here's an example. So if you have certain waters that are deemed for fishing and commercial fishing, it could be overfished. That could be very problematic. So over harvesting. And there's this very famous thing, the tragedy of the commons. So I believe this is in the colonial days, that there'd be like a common land, and they allowed people to let people's livestock come in and eat off of it. And this tragedy of the commons was that instead of just having people be reasonable and say, well, maybe Bob should do it today and I'll do it tomorrow, and then somebody else can do it the next day, people just kind of overran it. And so they tried to use this common resource because they thought, well, let me use that one first instead of my land, because my land only has a certain amount of grass. So let's go use the common stuff first, and then I'll come back to my land once I've used the common stuff. But what happened is that too many people did that, and the land became crappy. The grass was not good for any feeding of the animals, and so it took probably 3-4 years for it to get restored again. And so that's the tragedy of commons. It was over harvesting the public good, and this is why even today now, when people are allowed to use public lands for, let's say, grazing, since we're talking about grazing here, they have to pay a fee. So they don't want to make it just free. But of course, then there's a famous case of somebody trying to do this, trying to use public land and arguing that it's their right to do it, and they didn't want to pay for it either. Very selfish perspective. And if everybody did that, we would have this. If everybody did this, just took it easy, took turns, that's no problem. It's the people who want to use the land for their own benefit and they don't care about other people. That's an issue. So cooperation has to be done in a way that benefits everybody, because if you're just grabbing and trying to use all the public goods for yourself, then it's going to be like this. There's something called the contributions dilemma. So basically a social dilemma that encourages people to free ride. And they basically depend on the contributions of others for their benefit. So we just got done talking about group work. So this is one of your big, I'm guessing, most people actually don't like group work. And one of the reasons they don't like group work is they feel like essentially it sets up a contributions dilemma. So in most group work, you're probably told that you got to work together, and you got to do this thing, but your grade's going to be the same. So whatever you produce is going to be graded by the teacher or professor, and everybody in your group gets the same grade regardless of their contribution. So it sort of encourages this free riding. We call that social loafing with group work. So why should I work if everybody gets the same grade, and I know that this group member is really, really concerned about their grade, and they really seem smart. So I'm just going to lay back, let them do the work because they're really smart, they're really motivated, and then I'm going to get the same grade as them, and we're doing hardly any work. So a lot of you probably don't like group work because it's set up in a way that encourages free riding. This is the one I was thinking that this is not necessarily about the common good or the common goals or the shared resources that we were talking about in the other dilemmas. This is called Prisoner's Dilemma. This is actually based in reality. So if you've watched a lot of cop shows, you may be familiar with this, or detective shows. So if they get a couple people committing a crime together, what do? They separate them, and they want to make one quote-unquote flip. So at least in the New York police department dramas I've seen, is that they want to flip one of the skulls, they would call it. So they would want to flip one of the people that were part of the crime, and the idea is you separate them, and then you work them in a way that one person will give up the other person. So one person will decide it's better for them to say that they committed the crime together. The other person's going to get punished more, but they're going to save themselves. So that's the situation that this lab task was based on. So this is actually a lab experimental study that they do with people. So they bring them in and they basically give them this dilemma. They're set up in different ways, but basically they split two people, and if the two people cooperate, then all of them will get some sort of benefit. So let's say that the benefit goes from 0 to 5, and let's say it's dollars or tens of dollars or whatever, or hundreds of dollars, probably not hundreds, but tens of dollars. So if you cooperate, you're split up, you're separate, but you're cooperating, each of you will get $30. In the actual real life situation, it's like if both of you shut up and neither of you say anything about the crime, they're going to have to take you to trial. They won't have as much evidence, and maybe both of you will get off. There's a chance you'll be convicted, but there's also a chance you'll get off because they don't have they don't have a confession of one person who details and is a witness to the crime the other person committed. So there's a $30 reward here. And in the other situation, there's two other situations, but one situation is where one person gives up the other person. But in the prisoner's dilemma, it could be just one person decides to compete. So if one person decides to, hey, if I can compete, I could actually take more stuff away, and I'll get more reward. So if you're competing and the other person's, I don't want to say stupid, the other person is for some reason believing you're going to be cooperative, but you don't, you pull the rug out from under them, you're going to get $50, they're going to get nothing. So a player who decides to compete when the other player is thinking you're going to cooperate and they're cooperating, that person gets screwed, they get nothing, and you get $50. In the actual real life situation, if only you decide to give up evidence and confess and witness the crime of the other person, and the other person is cooperating by shutting up, you're going to get a lighter sentence, and that person's going to go to prison. And then in this situation too, then the lab situation is set up that if both of you decide, hey, maybe that other person's not a good person, they're not going to cooperate with me, I'm going to screw them over, I'm going to compete, I'm going to take what I can. If both of you do that, if both of you compete, you get $10. So if both of you would just cooperate, we got 30 each. But if both of you decide to compete, you only get $10. So if both people, players, decide to compete in this situation where you should cooperate, you get just $10. And I guess in the real life situations, that if everybody confesses and everybody thinks they has a deal on the table, you just have a confession for every single person, and you can prosecute them. Because I usually think they usually want you to confess before they actually make some sort of arrangement of an actual deal. And so if both of you confess, then you're both kind of screwed because you both confess to the crime, and there's no incentive to go lenient on either of you because you've both said you did it. So you're gonna get screwed if both of you get screwed if you both decide to compete. So this is a prisoner's dilemma. I'm going through this because this is a common research methodology that's used in social psychology. So if you hear prisoner's dilemma, this is what it looks like. Cooperate, you're going to have moderate level of rewards. That's kind of what you should be doing. If one of you is a jerk and decides to compete when the other person is hoping that you're going to cooperate with them, you're going to work with them, that person's going to get screwed, get nothing, you're going to get more. But if both of you say, I'm going to screw over the other person, you're going to end up with very little. So this is a social dilemma, and this is kind of used as a metaphor for real life. And not just the prison example, but in real life, if people cooperate, yes, maybe there's limited resources, common goods out there, but if you're cooperating, everybody's going to have a decent share. Everybody's going to have their sheep on the grass for a bit. You're going to have some benefit to it, but moderate, but it's a decent benefit, and everybody's going to get it. If you have people that say screw other people, I'm going to take my sheep there when everybody's asleep, and I'm going to have them graze all night, and then when people wake up in the morning, all the grass is gone. Well, screw them. They might get no grass, but my sheep are well fed, and I still have my own property I can use too if I need to. So in the place where there's common goods, if somebody decides they're going to grab everything they can, people are going to lose out. And if everybody decides to grab, then there's not going to be much there. So that's like basically, I think that's the tragedy of the commons. So everybody tries to grab, everybody's running there to get their sheep on there to graze on the grass. But what happens is the grass is really crappy, and there was a little bit of a benefit, but not much. The grass is going to be gone for another year or two. So this is sort of mirroring decisions people may make in relationship to common goods and the benefits or punishments you'll get for certain behavior. And here's you can read this. This is essentially what I just told you about. And then, there's obviously individual differences. So I think there's probably a lot of personality differences. So if you have an antisocial, narcissistic person who's in a prisoner's dilemma with you, you're pretty much screwed. They're going to look out for themselves. And you may end up just both competing, and you'll get not really that great of an outcome, but that may be better than just getting screwed by somebody. I think personality is a big thing here, but here we want to talk about other versus self-concern. So that's probably where narcissism fits too, because if you're high on narcissism, you're going to have a lot of self-concern. All you care about is yourself. If you care about other people, then you tend to be less narcissistic. So let's look at this. So you're concerned about yourself and what you're going to get, some more narcissistic, let's say. Here you're concerned about other people too. Less narcissistic. So if you are high on your own concerns and high about other people's, you might do problem solving. So yes, I do want all I can get out of this, but I realize there's other people here, and maybe the best situation is to talk with them and to solve this issue. So there's these things that we all want. What's the best way to approach it? If you're high on narcissism, so you're mainly just concerned about yourself, but you don't give a crap about other people, it's contending, which means basically grab what you can get. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there. Grab what you can get before other people get it. If you're low on narcissism, You don't care that much about your own outcomes, but you care a lot about other people. You might yield. You might say things like, oh, I don't really need it. That's fine. I understand other people need this stuff. So you're yielding, you're letting other people basically use those resources because you feel like you don't need them. And then if you're low on your own concern about yourself and low on concern about other people, you just sit back. Who cares? So people differ in terms of their reactions to these sort of competition versus competitive situations. And we're going to have a pretty short lecture this time, so we're going to end the lecture by talking about strategies for producing cooperation. So you might give rewards or incentives for cooperating. So this basically, the cooperative goal would be to have less air pollution. So have less air. So there's lots of benefits actually for carpooling and things like that. So there's going to be less air pollution. There's going to be a less demand for petroleum or gasoline, and therefore gas prices are going to be cheaper. It's going to have a lot of benefit to people in general if people carpool and just don't drive their own cars. So one strategy to increase the cooperative behavior of reducing the number of cars would be to give rewards to people who carpool. So there's carpool lanes. So if you're not driving by yourself, you can drive in these carpool lanes, and most of the time those carpool lanes have fewer cars, and so if there's traffic, you can go faster. So that's just one example, but just anything that gives you a reward for cooperating. Privatization, so instead of just saying, here's this public land, anybody can use it, you might want to divide it up and say, okay, each of you get a small part of this land to do what you want, but you only get that small part. You don't have access to the other stuff. And so the tragedy of the commons example is where there wasn't a division. It was just like everybody can use this common land, and everybody just basically overused it for their selfish reasons. But if you were told, well, you get this little section right here, you're going to use it a lot more carefully because you can only use that section. So typically when you do it like this, when you it's called privatization, people act more responsibly because they know if they use it up, then that's it for them. And so there's various benefits of this. And so I think it's not necessarily the same thing, but when I looked at this, I thought about privatization of government housing. So some people have said that housing projects that are just owned by the government are promoting irresponsible behavior because nobody feels ownership. So why do I care about the property? Why do I care what it looks like? Why do I care about anything about it? Because it's not mine. I don't have any stake in it. And so some people have argued that if you privatize it, so the government can build it, but then people buy apartments, then they feel more pride and they feel more responsibility for the apartment and for the apartment area a lot more. And so I think that model kind of increases cooperation because then I think people start talking about how to improve things. We've talked about this with group size, so having a big group is typically not that great. So typically smaller groups tend to cooperate more than large groups. There's probably many things. There's probably just simple communication. So obviously if it's a smaller group, you might communicate better than a large group. Typically also a smaller group, you tend to see everybody as individuals. You lack diffusion of responsibility. So if you're in a large group, there's a diffusion of responsibility. So just a simple example, let's say that, and there's research that shows this, if you're in a group of like 30 people and somebody falls down, you're less likely to help because you say, oh, somebody else will do it. So if you're in a smaller group, you're more likely to help, but just for anything. So If you're in a smaller group, you're going to feel like you need to be responsible and you need to be active. Whereas a bigger group, well, why should I cooperate? Because all these other people are not going to cooperate. They're going to grab their own stuff. In a larger group, you're going to start thinking about that. And then we talked about this with communication. So coordination difficulties. So a large group is harder to coordinate, harder to communicate. So typically, if you want a cooperative group, it's good to have a smaller group versus larger. So setting cooperative norms. So basically, there's some often implicit, so it's not said, but there's an understood social norm about how you're supposed to behave, and it's cooperative. So this is actually, this is Thai Airways, and this actually might be, actually looking at this, that actually might be Suvarnabhumi, perhaps, which is in Bangkok. No, it's not. It says you're going to Bangkok, so it isn't in Suvarnabhumi. It's some other place. But this is a cooperative sort of line here. And I've been in different airport situations or different airline situations, and there's some airlines that are like this, that whether it's a cultural norm or other norms where people line up very cooperatively. Nobody's trying to jump line. Everybody's waiting for their spot. And I've been in other airport lines where the line's just like it's not a line. It's just like a big mess of people trying to push up to the front. And of course, most of us hate that situation, right? It causes a lot of problems, right? And people start sort of hating each other, and people start pushing each other. And it's just sort of shows even these silly things like airport waiting lines. If there's not the cooperative norms, it can get really kind of nasty. And sometimes those norms aren't enforced. So I've seen where airlines have essentially made ropes and try to force people to be in a line. And so that's a more explicit norm that's set by somebody. Or I'm thinking of some of the queues that I've seen in Asia, especially like in Hong Kong, outside the rail station. I know why they do this too. Outside the rail station in Hong Kong, they have this winding thing where you can only stand one person at a time, and it forces you, if you're going to get a taxi, that you have to actually be cooperative, because there's really no opportunity for people to jump the line. Although I've seen people jump the line, and I've actually said things to people who've jumped the line. So some of these norms are implicit, but some of them are explicit. So obviously you want cooperative norms where you're all kind of playing by the same rules, and you kind of understand that it's better to be orderly, and nobody's trying to run out ahead of each other, because that just will create chaos and conflict. We already talked about communication. Obviously, you need to be very open and positive in your communication. So if you want cooperation, you need to talk about it. And you need to, if you're really thinking about these sort of social dilemmas, or in circumstances where there's limited amount of things you can get, people want more, of course, right? And so you have to be very positive in how you communicate, so that you can make an argument essentially that if we cooperate, we're all going to get a lot more than if we compete. Tit for tat, I'm not a real big believer of this, but maybe it works in some circumstances, which basically is like you show the other person that you're going to cooperate, and then if they cooperate in response to that, you cooperate back. And the hope is that, well, cooperate. But let's say I cooperate, and then somebody screws me over, and they compete, and then I'll screw them over and say, listen, pal, if you want it this way, we're going to have it this way, and guess what? You're going to end up with a lot less. So maybe you want to rethink what you're doing. So that's kind of the philosophy of the tit for tat. If everybody cooperates, that's kind of the easy thing, but if somebody breaks the norm, you slap them, and not physically, but you slap them and show them, listen, we can play it this way, but you ain't going to end up in a very good position. You're actually going to be better off cooperating. So that's kind of the That's the philosophy of the tit for tat. Is you try to argue with a person through your actions that they're going to end up getting less if they start setting up the situation of competition. So here's this formal conflict resolution. So I don't know if this is cooperation per se, to be quite frank. This might be more about what do you do with a conflict that can't end with the two parties alone. So how can you, and I don't know if this is necessarily cooperation, but at least ending conflict. You can negotiate, so you could try to have the parties work together and negotiate a resolution. Typically in negotiations, there's typically some party who's not the person. So a lot of negotiations you might have an agent or somebody who might try to represent your interests but isn't you. And then these two agents who aren't the people that are trying to get the stuff work it out. So I would guess that divorces. This is what's coming to my mind. Divorces that are kind of I won't say pleasant. That's not the right word. Are cooperative. So I'll use that word. Our cooperative divorces probably is the situation like, okay, we know if we sit down as a couple, we're going to fight over, stupid little things. So I'm going to have a lawyer. They're going to have a lawyer. The lawyers are going to sit down. They're going to work it out, and we're going to have a negotiated settlement here for the divorce. Mediation. So if you are, well, it says without embarrassment. I was going to say if you're a fan of Judge Judy, but she could embarrass people, but probably rightly so. Or court shows like that. Typically, that's typically called a mediation, actually, because it's not really a court. It's not a governmental body, but it's officially a mediator. And so each side presents their case, and the judge is actually a mediator who weighs the benefits of each person's argument, and they decide how to resolve the conflict. So here it says negotiation. I think more mediation tends to be it can differ. So some mediations could be negotiations, and other mediations could be, okay, you guys just cannot agree on this, and we're just going to sit you down, and I'm going to listen to both of you, but then I'm going to decide in the end what's right, and you sign a paper that tells me I have every right to do this. So I think mediation here is a little bit, I don't know about Pollyannish, but there's different types of mediation. So I think mediation where people have to see each other, I think that's what they're kind of talking about here. So if you have some sort of issue at work with a coworker, they might try mediation, knowing that you're going to have to be around your coworker all the time. And so the goal there is to try to resolve the conflict in a way that both people feel good about it, so that you can live with each other and you won't be fighting anymore at work. That's kind of the mediation we're talking about here. There's other mediation, which is what I'm talking about earlier, which is basically we can't resolve this, let somebody resolve this. But typically that type of mediation is when you aren't going to be interacting with that person much anymore in the future. So there's mediation, but I think there's sort of different tinges to mediation. And there's arbitration. So I think these words are thrown around a little bit differently in different circles, but basically here we're talking about arbitration as there's a conflict, and then somebody will arbitrate without the parties meeting. And so if having the parties meet leads to shouting and yelling at each other, let's just avoid that. You write up your case, and the other person will write up their case. I'll look over it, and I might call you. I might say, I've read this stuff that you've sent to me, and I have some questions. Please answer these questions. And you might do it with the other side. And then after you get all of the information, as the arbiter, you would basically say, okay, this is what's going to happen. And I think that's what they do if you're sports fans again. If you know baseball, I think baseball does arbitration this way. So what happens with arbitration is that the player's agent will say that they should get more money because they were more productive than I guess they that then was planned, and so therefore they deserve a higher salary than that's in their contract currently. And of course, the if it's an arbitration, the team says, well, not really. They were really under contract. Why don't they just take a little bit less than that? And we'll give them more, but not as much as they want. And typically that goes to arbitration. I believe it is arbitration like this, where the agent for the player will write up an argument about how much they should get. And then the team will write their argument about why they feel like the player should get a certain amount of money. And then an arbiter sits there and decides. I think in baseball, at least, they usually decide one or the other. So if one party has a certain money figure, the other party has a certain other money figure, I think the arbiter actually chooses one or the other. Although obviously in other situations, I think arbiters can kind of average out the stuff if they want to. So arbiter is basically a case where you don't want to set up a conflictual situation with the parties meeting together. And I guess I kind of, in terms of this example I'm giving, I can kind of understand it in baseball. You don't want essentially the player and their agent arguing with the team owner because it could lead to a very bad outcome. So I can kind of see why the team owners probably want this type of a situation. Although players can be sort of hurt by this and resent it, but they typically, as far as I know, they typically resent the arbiter rather than the team. Then finally, I put this in terms of another thing is an evolutionary perspective. We talked about this before. So from an evolutionary perspective, there's this thing called reciprocal altruism, which basically means it's not really true altruism. True altruism is I'm going to help people because I just feel like they should be helped. I don't care about if I get rewards. Reciprocal altruism is really not that. Reciprocal altruism is I'm going to help you out if I feel like there's a good chance you're going to help me out in the future. So reciprocal altruism occurs in cases where obviously where you think you're going to see or be in contact with that person a lot in the future. So there's going to be opportunities for them to pay you back essentially. And basically you also evaluate whether they actually are a person capable of helping you out in the future or whether they're selfish. So in situations where you feel like you're going to have a lot of opportunities, you're going to see them a lot, and they're basically a nice person, they're probably going to pay you back, they're going to help you out if they get a chance, then you're going to typically be cooperative. You know, I'm gonna be cooperative here because I know in the future when I need something, you're going to help me out. So this sort of idea of helping each other out over time is sort of an evolutionary perspective on being cooperative because it's something that could happen over and over again, and therefore it's my benefit to do it now because I might get something of benefit in the future. And I think that's about it. So I think that's a pretty concise lecture, and I will talk to you in the next lecture.